As daylight faded in Victorian Britain, the evening did not arrive suddenly. It settled in gradually, like a long breath being released. The sun lowered itself behind rows of brick houses and narrow streets, its light thinning into pale amber before disappearing altogether. In cities, the sky dimmed beneath a soft veil of coal smoke, while in the countryside, the last birdsong stretched lazily into silence. Evening was not an interruption of the day, but its slow conclusion. Inside homes, the transition from day to night followed familiar rhythms. Windows were closed carefully, not only to keep out the chill, but also to preserve warmth that had been gathered throughout the afternoon. Curtains were drawn early, thick fabrics meant to guard against drafts and prying eyes alike. In working-class homes, these curtains were often simple, sometimes faded, but they served the same purpose as the heavier drapes found in wealthier houses. Evening was private time, and the outside world was gently shut away.
Light was precious. Before electricity, illumination required intention. Oil lamps were cleaned, wicks trimmed, and matches struck with practiced care. Gas lighting, where available, hissed softly as it filled rooms with a yellowish glow. Candles were still common, especially in smaller homes, their flames flickering gently against the walls. Shadows danced in corners, stretching and shrinking as people moved. The light was never harsh. It softened faces, blurred edges, and made everything seem slower. The sounds of evening were subdued. The loud machinery of the day fell silent. Shops closed their doors. Horse-drawn carts rattled past less frequently. Footsteps echoed briefly, then faded. Indoors, the dominant sounds were modest ones: the clink of crockery, the rustle of fabric, the quiet murmur of conversation. Even laughter was softer in the evening, as if the time itself encouraged restraint.
Meals in the Victorian evening varied greatly by class, but they all carried a sense of closure. For working families, supper was often simple and filling. Bread, cheese, stew, or leftovers from earlier meals were common. The food was eaten without hurry, but without ceremony. It was nourishment before rest. In middle and upper-class households, dinner could be a longer affair, served later in the evening and involving multiple courses. Yet even there, the pace was unhurried. Conversation drifted easily, often returning to familiar topics: the weather, small observations from the day, or quiet reflections on recent news. After the meal, dishes were cleared methodically. There was no rush. The act of cleaning was part of the evening's rhythm. Hands moved from habit, minds already beginning to loosen from the day's concerns. In many homes, the kitchen remained warm long after cooking ended, making it a natural gathering place. Elsewhere, families moved into sitting rooms or parlors, spaces designed for calm occupation rather than work. Reading was one of the most common evening activities. Books, newspapers, and serialized novels provided a gentle escape. In households where literacy was widespread, reading aloud was popular. One person would sit near the lamp and read, while others listened, sewing, mending clothes, or simply resting. The voice of the reader became part of the room's atmosphere, steady and measured. Stories unfolded slowly, often ending at a cliffhanger that would not be resolved until the next installment, encouraging patience rather than urgency. Writing letters was another quiet ritual of the Victorian evening. Pens were dipped carefully into ink, words formed deliberately. Letters were thoughtful, often lengthy, and composed without expectation of immediate reply. The act of writing itself was calming, requiring focus and stillness. Even the pauses mattered, moments where the writer gazed into space, considering the next sentence as the lamp burned steadily beside them. Music sometimes filled the evening air, though rarely loudly. A piano in the corner of a parlor might be played softly, familiar melodies practiced again and again. In homes without instruments, singing filled the gap. Hymns, folk songs, or popular tunes of the day were shared quietly. Music was not performance, it was presence. It occupied the room without demanding attention, blending into the fabric of the night. For children, evening marked a gentle winding down rather than an abrupt ending. Younger ones were washed and changed, their routines consistent and comforting. Bedtime stories, prayers, or quiet conversation eased them toward sleep. Older children might remain awake longer, sitting with the family, absorbing the calm. There was little artificial stimulation to keep them alert. Darkness itself encouraged rest.
The Victorian understanding of time was different from the modern one. Evenings were not packed with activities. There was no expectation to be entertained constantly. Silence was not uncomfortable. It was normal. Moments passed without being filled, and no one felt compelled to chase them. The ticking of a clock, if one was present, was often the loudest sound in the room, marking time steadily without urgency. Outdoors, the streets grew quieter. Gas lamps cast pools of light onto cobblestones, creating islands of visibility surrounded by shadow. Night watchmen made their rounds, their presence reassuring rather than intrusive. In smaller towns and villages, darkness was deeper and more complete. Without urban lighting, the night sky revealed itself fully, stars clear and numerous. The world felt larger, but also calmer. In wealthier households, servants quietly completed their duties as the family settled into rest. Movements were efficient and unobtrusive. The goal was not to disturb the calm that evening brought. Even work, when it occurred, was subdued. Tasks were finished under low light. Conversations kept minimal. As the hour grew later, fatigue was accepted naturally. There was no resistance to sleep. People did not fight tiredness with stimulants or glowing screens. When eyes grew heavy, it was seen as a signal, not an inconvenience. Lamps were extinguished one by one. Candles were pinched out carefully. Rooms returned to darkness. Bedrooms were simple but purposeful. Beds were prepared earlier, warmed if possible with hot bricks or extra blankets. The act of undressing was unhurried. Night clothes were practical, designed for warmth and comfort. Before sleep, many paused briefly, reflecting on the day, offering a quiet prayer, or simply listening to the sounds of the house settling around them. The Victorian evening ended not with a sharp boundary, but with a gradual fading. Awareness softened, thoughts slowed. The world narrowed to the gentle rhythm of breathing and the steady presence of darkness. Sleep came not as an escape, but as a continuation of the same calm that had filled the evening hours. In contrast, homes untouched by industrial schedules experienced evenings guided more by light than by clocks. In rural areas, the fading sky determined activity. Tasks were finished when sight grew dim, not when a specific hour arrived. Animals were settled, tools put away, doors secured. Indoors, the same rhythms repeated themselves each night, so familiar that they required little thought. The predictability itself was comforting. Social expectations also softened in the evening. Formal behavior relaxed slightly, even among those who observed strict etiquette during the day. Clothing became less rigid, shoes were loosened or removed, jackets were set aside. Conversations lost their public tone and grew more personal, though still restrained. Even emotions were expressed more gently at night, filtered through fatigue and reflection. Tea, for those who could afford it, played a quiet but important role. Not the hurried cup taken during the day, but an evening serving meant to soothe rather than stimulate. Teapots were warmed, leaves measured carefully, and cups handled with familiarity. The act of pouring tea was slow, almost ceremonial, but without grandeur. Steam rose briefly, then disappeared. The warmth lingered in the hands longer than the taste did on the tongue. Smell was a defining feature of the Victorian evening. The sharpness of coal smoke softened indoors, mingling with food, fabric, soap, and human presence. In some homes, lavender sachets or other herbs were placed in drawers and rooms, subtle attempts to control the environment.
In poorer households, smells were simply accepted as part of life. Evening did not erase them, it merely wrapped them in darkness. News traveled differently at night. Without constant updates or instant communication, information arrived slowly and was absorbed at an equally slow pace. A newspaper read in the evening might contain events already days old. This did not lessen its importance. If anything, the delay gave news weight. People discussed it thoughtfully, considering implications rather than reacting impulsively. Silence often followed such discussions, not awkward but contemplative. In some neighborhoods, evening walks were common, not brisk exercise but gentle movement. Couples strolled arm in arm, neighbors exchanged brief greetings. The streets, though dim, felt familiar and safe. Gas lamps flickered overhead, their light imperfect but sufficient. Shadows stretched across walls and pavement, moving subtly as clouds passed overhead. These walks were not destinations, but pauses between day and night.
Public houses drew a portion of the population, especially men seeking companionship after work. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter than daytime caricatures suggest. Conversation hummed at a low level. Drinks were sipped, not rushed. Even here, the evening imposed restraint. Loud behavior was frowned upon, and most patrons understood the unspoken rule that night was for settling, not escalating. For women, evenings often included work that went unseen: mending, organizing, planning for the next day. These tasks were done without complaint, woven seamlessly into the calm. Hands moved while minds wandered. The repetitive nature of such work allowed thoughts to drift, memories to surface, worries to soften. Evening provided space for inner life, even when the body remained occupied. Children, half listening to adult conversations, learned through observation. They absorbed social rhythms without instruction: when to speak, when to remain silent, when to rest. Evening taught patience. There was no immediate reward, no constant stimulation. Boredom, when it appeared, was not treated as a problem. It passed on its own. As darkness deepened, sounds became more distinct. A distant train whistle carried farther. A dog bark echoed longer than it would during the day. The house itself produced small noises: settling wood, ticking clocks, the faint movement of air. These sounds were familiar, reassuring in their consistency. They marked presence rather than disturbance. In wealthier districts, some evenings included visits. Guests arrived at a measured hour, announced formally. Conversation followed predictable patterns. Seating was arranged carefully. Yet even these gatherings bowed to the nature of the night. They ended earlier than daytime events might. Candles burned down. Energy waned. Departure was polite and unhurried. Privacy took on new importance at night. Letters were folded and set aside. Personal thoughts were allowed more space. The absence of bright light made introspection easier. Faces half seen revealed less, allowing emotions to exist without scrutiny. People thought about aging, about loss, about hope, often without putting these thoughts into words. The concept of productivity held little power in the evening. There was no pressure to optimize time. To sit quietly was acceptable. To do nothing was not viewed as wasteful. Evening belonged to rest in its broadest sense, including mental rest. As bedtime approached, routines unfolded naturally. Water was fetched, lamps were lowered, doors were checked. These actions were not rushed, nor were they delayed unnecessarily. They followed the internal clock shaped by years of repetition. Even children sensed when the night had reached its final stage. Sleep itself was understood differently. It was not something to be chased or managed, but something that arrived when invited. The body was trusted to know when it was ready. If sleep did not come immediately, one lay quietly, listening, thinking, waiting without anxiety. Darkness was not an enemy. It was familiar and enveloping. Dreams, though rarely discussed openly, held quiet significance. People believed dreams carried meaning, but they did not obsess over them.
A dream was something to reflect on briefly in the morning, then release. The night was not meant to be analyzed while it was happening. Outside, the city or countryside settled fully. Even the most active neighborhoods reached a point of stillness. Smoke thinned, lamps dimmed. The boundary between structures softened in darkness, making streets and buildings feel less rigid, more fluid. Thus, the Victorian evening completed its arc, not with spectacle or drama, but with continuity. It mirrored the values of the time: patience, restraint, acceptance of limits. The night was not conquered or filled, but respected. It closes the day gently, leaving space for rest, memory, and quiet anticipation of morning. As the night continued to deepen, the Victorian evening revealed another of its quieter qualities, the way memory seemed closer after dark. Without strong light or urgent tasks, the mind wandered more freely. People thought about earlier stages of their lives, about childhood homes, lost relatives, or places left behind. Migration from countryside to city had separated many families, and evening was often the time when absence was felt most clearly. A chair left empty, a voice no longer heard, became more noticeable when the day's noise receded. Objects gained a different presence at night. Everyday items, unnoticed during daylight, seemed to hold stories when shadows softened their outlines. A worn table bore marks from years of meals. A cracked teacup reminded someone of a gift long ago. These things were not curated for nostalgia, yet they carried it naturally. The Victorian evening allowed people to sit with such quiet reminders without feeling the need to resolve them. In many homes, fire played a central role. A small hearth or stove offered not just warmth, but focus. Flames moved slowly, predictably, drawing the eye without demanding attention. Watching fire was a common evening habit, one that required no explanation. Time passed almost unnoticed as sparks rose and faded. The fire did not entertain, it accompanied. The pace of breathing itself seemed to slow during these hours. Bodies adjusted instinctively to darkness. Shoulders dropped, voices lowered. Even thoughts softened around the edges. The absence of bright light and constant stimulation created a natural form of rest long before sleep arrived. Illness, when present, also shaped the evening. Without modern medicine or constant monitoring, care was quieter and more personal. A family member might sit beside a bed, holding a hand, offering water, or simply being present. Evening was the time for such care, when the rest of the household had stilled. Concern existed, but panic rarely did. There was an acceptance that night belonged to uncertainty as much as to rest. In boarding houses and shared lodgings, evenings required subtle negotiation. Space was limited, privacy minimal. Still, unspoken rules governed behavior. People learned to coexist quietly, respecting one another's need for rest. Lamps were positioned carefully. Movements were deliberate. Even disagreement softened at night, postponed until daylight if possible. The Victorian relationship with darkness itself was complex. Darkness was not merely the absence of light. It was a condition with character. It was associated with vulnerability, certainly, but also with protection. Darkness hid imperfections, eased self-consciousness, and allowed people to exist without constant observation. In an era deeply concerned with appearances, night offered relief. Outside the home, certain professions came alive in the evening. Bakers began work for the next day. Night watchmen walked their routes. Railway workers prepared for early departures. These figures moved through the dark with familiarity, becoming part of the background rhythm. Most people rarely saw them, but they were reassured by their existence. Time itself felt thicker at night. Minutes seemed longer, not because they were filled with activity, but because attention was not constantly divided. A single sound, a single thought, could occupy several moments. This slower perception of time shaped emotional life. Feelings were experienced more fully. but also more gently. In some households, religious practice marked the evening. Quiet prayers, readings, or moments of reflection provided structure. These acts were not dramatic displays of faith, but habitual acknowledgments of the day's end. They offered reassurance that order extended beyond human schedules. Dreaming about the future often occurred in the evening as well. Plans were imagined without urgency: a possible move, a hoped-for letter, a child's education. Such thoughts were held loosely, without immediate action. Evening allowed hope to exist without pressure. The absence of artificial noise made natural sounds more prominent: wind moving through trees, rain on rooftops, distant animals. These sounds reminded people of their place within a larger environment. The boundary between indoor and outdoor life felt thinner at night. Even clothing seemed to relax. Day garments were carefully constructed, restrictive by design. Evening wear at home was softer, looser, more forgiving. This physical comfort supported mental unwinding. The body was no longer required to perform a role. For the elderly, evening often brought a different awareness. Fatigue arrived earlier, memories surfaced more easily. The quiet highlighted the passage of time itself. Yet there was also peace in familiarity. The evening routine had repeated across decades, unchanged in its essentials. Young adults experienced evening differently. It could be a time of restlessness, of unspoken desires, of imagination. Limited social freedom meant much remained internal. The night held possibilities that daylight did not openly permit. As the hours passed, the household moved gradually toward stillness. One by one, people withdrew from shared spaces. Footsteps grew softer. Doors closed gently. The house seemed to exhale. Sleep did not arrive as a single event, but as a sequence. First came rest, then drowsiness, then the slow drifting of consciousness. The mind released the day not all at once, but piece by piece. Even waking during the night was accepted. People might rise briefly, adjust a blanket, look out a window at the moonlit street, then return to bed without distress. The night was not something to control. By the time true silence settled, the Victorian evening had fulfilled its purpose. It had slowed bodies, softened minds, and carried individuals gently from the structured demands of daylight into the openness of night. This pattern, repeated night after night, shaped how people understood time, rest, and themselves. The ordinary evening was not remarkable because of what happened, but because of what did not. There was no rush, no constant demand, no relentless brightness. As night settled more completely, the Victorian evening revealed subtleties that were rarely noticed in daylight, moments shaped not by action but by awareness. The boundary between public identity and private self became softer. During the day, individuals moved through rigid social structures, mindful of appearance, speech, and behavior. Evening loosened these constraints. Alone with family, or even alone with oneself, there was room to exist without constant self-correction. In many homes, the evening was when unspoken thoughts surfaced, not necessarily spoken aloud, but acknowledged internally. Regrets, small hopes, quiet satisfactions all found space here. The lack of distraction made inner life more vivid. Yet this was not overwhelming. The slowness of the hour acted as a buffer, allowing thoughts to rise and fall gently rather than collide. The Victorian relationship with privacy was deeply tied to evening. During the day, especially in dense urban settings, privacy was limited. Homes were close together, streets crowded, workspaces shared. Night restored a sense of personal territory. Closed doors and drawn curtains created small worlds where individuals could retreat. This retreat was not isolation, but relief. Lighting continued to shape behavior even late into the evening. Lamps were adjusted carefully to conserve fuel. Brightness was rarely increased. Instead, it was reduced gradually. This slow dimming mirrored the internal winding down of thought and movement. There was an intuitive understanding that light guided the body toward rest. In households with multiple generations, evening highlighted differences in pace and perception. Younger members lingered longer, eyes still alert, minds drifting. Older ones moved toward rest sooner, guided by habit and fatigue. These differences were accepted without comment. Evening did not demand uniformity. Books closed not because a chapter ended, but because eyes tired. Conversations ended not because topics were exhausted, but because silence felt appropriate. This acceptance of natural limits was central to the Victorian evening. There was no cultural push to extend wakefulness beyond comfort. Weather played an increasing role as night deepened. Fog crept into streets, muffling sound and narrowing vision. Frost formed quietly on windows. Wind shifted direction, heard more clearly in the absence of daytime noise. These changes were noticed, sometimes commented on briefly, then accepted. Nature set the terms of the night. In urban areas, the glow of gas lamps reflected faintly on low clouds, creating a subdued halo over the city. It was not brightness, but presence. This dim illumination reassured residents that order persisted even in darkness. Night was not chaos. It was regulated, observed, and contained. The emotional tone of evening leaned toward moderation. Extreme feelings felt out of place. Joy was quieter, sorrow more reflective. Anger, when present, lost its urgency. The evening encouraged emotional settling, a return to balance after the fluctuations of the day. Timepieces, when consulted, were checked less frequently. There was no urgency to measure remaining hours. The evening did not belong to productivity, so timekeeping loosened its grip. The body, rather than the clock, became the guide. In some homes, the evening was when small acts of care occurred. A garment was laid out for the next day. Shoes were placed neatly. A note was written and left where it would be found in the morning. These gestures carried intention forward across time, connecting night to day. The Victorian evening also held space for imagination. Without visual overload, the mind created its own images. Stories read earlier replayed internally. Memories blended with fiction. The boundary between thought and dream began to blur well before sleep arrived. Sound remained minimal but meaningful. The closing of a distant door, the faint whistle of wind through a gap, the low creak of stairs. These sounds confirmed presence, continuity, and safety. Silence was never absolute, but it was gentle. In boarding schools and institutional settings, evening routines were more structured, but still followed the same principle of gradual withdrawal. Lights out did not come abruptly. There was time for quiet reading, whispered conversation, personal reflection. Even authority softened at night. For those living alone, evening carried a different weight. Silence was deeper, more personal. Yet loneliness was not always distressing. Many found comfort in the predictability of their routines. Evening became a companion rather than a void. The act of preparing for bed was unremarkable, but meaningful. Washing, changing, arranging personal items. These actions marked a transition, not just to sleep, but to vulnerability. Clothing and posture changed, signaling trust in the environment. Bedrooms were rarely ornate, even in wealthy homes. They were designed for rest, not display. The simplicity reinforced the evening's purpose. There was no expectation of stimulation or novelty. Sleep itself was viewed as necessary, not indulgent. There was no guilt attached to rest. Fatigue was respected as a signal, not ignored or overridden. This cultural attitude shaped the evening profoundly. Nightmares and restlessness existed, of course, but they were understood as part of life rather than personal failures. If sleep was interrupted, one waited patiently for its return. The Victorian evening also functioned as a social equalizer in subtle ways. Regardless of status, everyone experienced darkness. Everyone rested. Wealth changed comfort, not the fundamental rhythm. In times of uncertainty or grief, evening became heavier. Silence carried more weight. Yet even then, the routine persisted. The structure of the evening provided stability when other aspects of life felt fragile.
As hours passed, the world outside seemed increasingly distant. The immediate surroundings, the bed, the room, the sound of breathing, became primary. Attention narrowed naturally. The final moments before sleep were often unremarkable. There was no ceremony. Consciousness faded quietly. The evening completed its task without announcement. Across cities, towns, and villages, this process unfolded simultaneously. Millions of ordinary evenings, overlapping but separate, each carrying individuals gently into rest. This repetition created continuity across generations. The Victorian evening was learned by observing elders, then repeated unconsciously. It was cultural knowledge transmitted through habit rather than instruction. Long after individuals forgot specific days, they remembered the feeling of evening, the warmth of lamplight, the hush of night, the sense of being contained. In this way, the ordinary Victorian evening shaped not just daily life, but memory itself. It became the backdrop against which lives unfolded, quietly, steadily, night after night. As the night advanced toward its deepest hours, the Victorian evening continued to unfold in ways that were rarely spoken of, but quietly understood. This was the time when the boundary between inner life and outer world became almost transparent. Thoughts no longer felt anchored to immediate surroundings. Instead, they drifted freely, shaped by memory, imagination, and fatigue. The mind loosened its grip on certainty, allowing ideas to wander without direction or purpose. For many, this late portion of the evening was when the sense of self felt least defined by social role. Titles, duties, and expectations faded into the background. A factory worker was no longer a laborer, a clerk no longer a clerk, a housekeeper no longer defined solely by tasks. In the quiet, individuals simply existed, unobserved and unmeasured. This unstructured awareness was rare during the day and deeply restorative. The physical environment reinforced this shift. Furniture took on softer outlines in low light. Walls seemed farther away, ceilings higher. Rooms felt less like controlled spaces and more like shelters. Even modest homes acquired a sense of intimacy and protection during these hours, as though darkness itself contributed to their stability. In households where several people shared sleeping spaces, late evening required careful coordination. Movements were minimized. One learned to navigate the room without sight, guided by memory and touch. These practiced gestures, reaching for a blanket, avoiding a creaking board, became second nature. Silence was preserved not through strict rules, but through mutual awareness. The Victorian evening also allowed for a kind of emotional honesty that daylight discouraged. Feelings that had been suppressed for practicality emerged quietly. There was room for sadness without explanation, for contentment without justification. The absence of witnesses made emotions less performative and more genuine. Letters written late in the evening often carried a different tone from those composed earlier. Words were chosen more carefully, sentences longer and more reflective. Writers allowed themselves pauses, moments where the pen hovered over paper as thoughts settled. These letters were less concerned with efficiency and more with connection. They were meant to be read slowly, perhaps in another evening just like this one. The sense of time during these hours became increasingly abstract. Without visual cues or frequent reference to clocks, minutes blended together. The evening did not progress toward a goal, it simply unfolded. This lack of direction was not unsettling, it was expected.
Night was not for achievement, but for surrender. In areas near rivers, docks, or canals, water sounds became more noticeable. The gentle movement of current, the occasional creak of a moored vessel, the distant call of a night worker. These sounds reminded listeners that movement continued beyond their walls, even as their own activity slowed. Smaller sensory details gained prominence: the texture of fabric against skin, the faint warmth lingering in a teacup, the subtle scent of extinguished flame. These sensations grounded individuals in the present moment, offering quiet reassurance of continuity. The Victorian evening was also a time when worries softened rather than disappeared. Problems were not solved at night, but they were set aside. There was an understanding that clarity belonged to daylight. Evening was for rest from concern as much as from labor. In homes with pets, animals adjusted instinctively to the rhythm of night. Cats settled near warmth, dogs rested close to familiar sounds. Their calm presence reinforced the sense of safety and routine. Humans and animals shared the same quiet space, bound by habit rather than instruction. For some, the late evening was a time of spiritual reflection, detached from formal religion. Thoughts turned to meaning, to the passage of life, to questions without answers. These reflections were not urgent. They drifted gently, like clouds across a darkened sky. The night air, when allowed inside through a cracked window, carried subtle changes. Cooler temperatures sharpened awareness. The distant smell of damp earth or smoke hinted at environments beyond immediate surroundings. Breathing slowed naturally, responding to the quieter world. In crowded urban districts, even late at night, there was never complete silence. But the sounds that remained were softened, filtered by distance and darkness. The constant hum of human activity receded into something almost natural, like wind or water. The Victorian evening also carried an implicit trust in routine. People trusted that morning would come, that work would resume, that life would continue. This trust allowed them to release control temporarily, knowing it could be reclaimed later. Children, if awake, experienced this time differently. The world felt larger and more mysterious. Shadows suggested stories. Sounds sparked imagination. Yet fear was not the dominant emotion. Familiar surroundings and adult presence provided reassurance. In the final stages of evening, awareness narrowed further. Thoughts became less linear. Memory and sensation intertwined. The boundary between waking and dreaming thinned. This transition was not abrupt. It was gradual and accepted. People did not seek perfect comfort. Beds might be firm, rooms cool. Discomfort was tolerated, not analyzed. The expectation was not luxury, but rest. The body adjusted. Occasionally, a distant church bell marked the hour. Its sound traveled far in the stillness, reminding listeners of shared time across the community. These bells were not alarms, but markers of continuity. The Victorian evening also allowed grief its quiet space. Losses were remembered more keenly at night, but also more gently. Without distraction, mourning found expression through stillness rather than tears. Memory became companionship. In boarding houses, inns, and lodgings, strangers shared the same night without interaction. The awareness of others breathing, shifting, sleeping nearby created a sense of shared humanity without intimacy. Evening equalized differences. The act of lying still became a form of participation in the night. One did not need to sleep immediately. Simply resting was enough. The body knew what to do. Eventually, consciousness loosened its hold entirely. Thoughts fragmented, sensations blurred. The evening completed its work. Across the Victorian world, this process repeated endlessly. Millions of individuals, unknown to one another, entered the same quiet state. Different lives, different struggles, yet the same night. This shared experience created a subtle connection across distance and class. Darkness did not discriminate. Fatigue did not choose favorites. Evening belonged to everyone. Long after specific evenings were forgotten, their rhythm remained embedded in memory. The slow dimming of light, the quiet acceptance of rest, the sense of being carried rather than driven. In this way, the ordinary Victorian evening shaped not only nights, but lives. It taught patience, acceptance, and trust in cycles beyond individual control. And as sleep finally claimed the body, the evening released its final gift, a pause, a suspension of effort, a moment where nothing was required. As the night stretched further, the Victorian evening revealed an even quieter layer, one that existed beyond routine and habit. This was the hour when consciousness thinned, yet awareness did not vanish. People hovered in a space between attention and release, where thoughts no longer followed logic but emotion. Memories surfaced without invitation, not sharply, but as impressions. Faces without voices, places without names, feelings without clear cause. In this late evening stillness, the sense of belonging shifted. During the day, belonging was tied to work, family, neighborhood, or class. At night, it became more abstract. One belonged simply to the moment, to the room, to the shared darkness that covered rooftops and fields alight. There was comfort in knowing that countless others were experiencing a similar quiet, even if separated by walls, streets, or miles of countryside. The Victorian evening also softened the relationship between body and mind. Physical tiredness muted mental sharpness, but in return, the mind grew more forgiving. Harsh judgments eased. Self-criticism lost urgency. People were less likely to replay conversations or imagine alternate outcomes. Evening did not demand improvement, it allowed acceptance. In houses built close together, the presence of neighbors was sensed rather than seen. A faint cough through a wall, a distant step on stairs, the murmur of a voice settling into sleep. These sounds were not intrusive. They reassured. They confirmed that life continued quietly on all sides. In contrast, isolated homes experienced a deeper silence. Here, the evening felt expansive. Darkness pressed against windows, vast and uninterrupted. Yet this was not fear-inducing. Familiarity with solitude shaped confidence. The quiet belonged to the inhabitants as much as the land around them. The Victorian evening was also a time when creativity appeared without effort. Not the active creation of art, but of passive imagining. Scenes formed behind closed eyes. Stories unfolded without structure. The mind wandered gently, unconcerned with coherence. This mental drifting was neither productive nor wasted. It was simply human. Those who had endured loss often found evening particularly meaningful. During the day, survival required function. At night, grief was allowed to exist without disguise. Yet even then, sorrow was tempered by routine. The knowledge that the night would end, that morning would arrive, provided quiet reassurance. The environment itself seemed to slow respiration. Without harsh light or noise, the body aligned naturally with the rhythm of night. Heartbeat steadied, muscles relaxed. The effort of holding oneself upright in the world diminished. In places where fireplaces still glowed faintly, embers pulsed softly, casting intermittent light. Watching these embers was a form of meditation long before the term existed. Attention rested lightly, neither focused nor scattered. Victorian evenings did not encourage reflection through instruction, but through absence. The absence of demands created space. The absence of brightness created calm. The absence of interruption allowed continuity of thought. In institutional spaces such as hospitals or workhouses, the evening carried a different tone, but followed the same principle. Activity decreased. Voices lowered. Authority receded slightly. Even in rigid systems, night imposed a measure of humanity. For travelers staying in inns, evening offered temporary belonging. Rooms unfamiliar by day felt safer at night. The knowledge that others rested nearby reduced distance. Sleep arrived with trust rather than caution. The Victorian evening also shaped how people experienced aging. As years passed, evenings grew more significant. Daytime energy shortened, but night remained steady. Evening routines anchored identity when other roles shifted. Young children, drifting in and out of wakefulness, experienced evening as a dreamlike extension of the day. Their understanding of time was fluid. The boundary between story and reality blurred easily. Older children, lying awake longer, sensed the weight of adult quiet. This awareness shaped their understanding of maturity. Night was associated with seriousness, calm, and restraint. The late evening rarely included decision-making. Choices were postponed. Clarity was expected later. This cultural patience reduced anxiety. One did not need to resolve life before sleeping. Outside, weather continued its quiet transformations. Clouds shifted, stars emerged or vanished. Frost settled invisibly. These changes occurred without audience or acknowledgement, yet they shaped the night just the same. Victorian evenings also carried a subtle humility. Darkness reminded people of limits. Vision narrowed, control diminished. Yet this limitation was not resented. It was integrated into daily life. The act of closing one's eyes did not signal defeat or escape. It signaled trust. Trust in the home, the environment, the routine, and the continuation of life beyond consciousness. Even those who struggled to sleep did not view wakefulness as failure. Lying still was acceptable. Night did not require efficiency. The shared understanding that night belonged to rest influenced behavior deeply. Social pressure did not encourage constant engagement. Withdrawal was not antisocial, it was expected. In this way, the Victorian evening created a collective rhythm that supported mental balance. Individuals were not isolated in their tiredness. Fatigue was universal and accepted. As the final moments before sleep arrived, awareness softened further. Thoughts lost edges. Sensations blurred. The body surrendered naturally. Across cities and villages, homes entered near silence. Lamps extinguished. Breathing slowed. Movement ceased. The evening, having done its quiet work, released its hold. It did not disappear, it transformed into night. As the hours slipped even closer to midnight, the Victorian evening entered a phase that few would have named, yet many would have recognized. It was a time when the world felt temporarily suspended, no longer belonging to the day that had passed, but not yet surrendered fully to sleep. In this interval, reality softened. The edges of thought blurred, and the distinction between intention and instinct became faint. In these late moments, the body moved almost automatically. A hand adjusted a blanket without conscious decision. A person turned on their side simply because it felt right. There was no strategy in these movements, only response. The body knew the evening better than the mind did, having learned its patterns over countless nights. The Victorian evening also had a way of equalizing emotional weight. Events that had felt significant earlier lost some of their intensity. Successes became quieter, failures less sharp. Even conflicts faded into abstraction. Night gently rearranged importance, reminding people, without words, that few things demanded immediate resolution. In homes where multiple rooms stood empty at night, darkness created the illusion of space expanding. Corridors felt longer, staircases deeper. Shadows connected rooms into a single continuous presence. The house felt less like a collection of areas and more like a single shelter holding everyone within it. Silence at this hour was different from earlier quiet. It was not merely the absence of sound, but a fullness of stillness. Even the smallest noise carried meaning. A distant floorboard creak might indicate someone else turning in their sleep. A faint breath confirmed life nearby. These sounds did not interrupt rest, they accompanied it. In industrial cities, the late Victorian evening carried a distinct atmosphere. Smoke thinned as fires burned low. The air cooled. The city seemed to loosen its grip on itself. Streets that had been crowded hours earlier felt strangely wide and open, even if unseen. The knowledge of emptiness altered perception. For those whose work extended into the night, the evening had a different rhythm but the same spirit. A lamplighter finishing his rounds, a nurse tending quietly, a printer preparing pages for morning distribution. Their movements were unhurried. Night did not rush them, it shaped their pace.
In this phase of evening, memory became less chronological. The mind no longer replayed the day in order. Instead, moments surfaced randomly. A sound from childhood, a smell from another season. These memories did not demand interpretation. They drifted through awareness, then faded. Victorian culture placed little emphasis on articulating these inner experiences. There was no expectation to analyze one's emotional state. People accepted the movement of thought as naturally as the movement of clouds. Evening was not a problem to solve, it was a condition to inhabit. In shared sleeping quarters, people synchronized unconsciously. Breathing rhythms aligned. Movement decreased collectively. Even without intention, bodies adapted to one another. This quiet coordination created a sense of safety rooted in presence rather than conversation. The late evening also softened the fear of darkness that children sometimes carried. Familiar routines repeated night after night created trust. Darkness no longer meant unknown, it meant expected. The world behaved predictably at night, even if unseen. In rural areas, the absence of artificial light made the night feel vast. Yet this vastness was not overwhelming. People who lived close to nature understood darkness as part of the landscape. Stars, when visible, provided orientation rather than distraction.
Victorian evenings did not invite spectacle. There were no bright finales, no climactic moments. Their value lay in continuity. Each evening resembled the last closely enough to feel familiar, yet different enough to feel alive. This familiarity allowed people to carry burdens without collapse. Grief, worry, and uncertainty were held within the framework of routine. Evening did not eliminate hardship, but it gave it a place to rest. As consciousness drifted further, language itself loosened. Words became less precise internally. Thoughts turned into impressions rather than sentences. Meaning existed without structure. The body, now fully disengaged from effort, responded primarily to comfort. A cooler spot on the pillow prompted a small shift. A sound outside registered briefly, then dissolved. Vigilance faded without alarm. In the Victorian understanding of life, night was not separate from day, but complementary. Day demanded engagement. Night permitted release. Evening bridged these states, teaching balance through repetition. Even those who lay awake longer than usual rarely felt isolated in their wakefulness. The knowledge that others, too, lay quietly somewhere nearby created connection. Night was a shared condition, not a solitary one.
The passage of time during this phase became nearly imperceptible. Minutes lost definition. The evening no longer moved forward, it hovered. This suspension was not anxiety-inducing, it was restful. In moments of half-sleep, thoughts combined strangely. A memory merged with a sound. An imagined place blended with the present room. These fleeting states were not resisted. They were signs that the evening was completing its work. Eventually, effort ceased entirely. Awareness dimmed without ceremony. There was no clear point where evening ended and sleep began. One simply gave way to the other. Across Victorian Britain, this quiet transition occurred night after night. Different homes, different lives. The same gentle descent into rest. This repetition shaped character as much as any public institution. It taught patience, acceptance, and trust in cycles beyond individual control. The ordinary Victorian evening did not strive to be memorable, yet it left deep impressions. Its influence was subtle but lasting. It trained minds to slow,
bodies to listen and emotions to settle.